question is the bill be now read the second time. The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to stand and speak today in support of the Carers Recognition Bill, and it's been incredibly valuable to hear contributions from other members on the bill, which have all been very, I think, heartfelt and genuine, and have included some reflections that I feel particularly privileged to have been able to hear and share. This is an important and significant piece of legislation. It's long overdue, as we've heard. I'd like to thank the Minister and the Department of Community Staff for their work in bringing forward this piece of legislation. And I'd also particularly like to thank those advocates in the community and the leadership from Carers Tasmania for their ongoing advocacy to see this formal legislative recognition for carers finally come to fruition. I know that David and Julie and others who contribute to the work of Carers Tas have all been tireless in this and have gone above and beyond to support our Tasmanian carers and ensure that their voices are heard, and have provided input and shaping of this legislation and the associated policy decisions and policy making that goes around it and feeds into things such as the action plan. I note the significant role that carers play in our society, Mr President, and others have gone into some detail around the data in relation to that. We do know that Tasmania does have quite a high ratio, the highest in the nation, of carers within our community. And they're people that don't necessarily get out there and wave flags around and have bells and whistles attached. They're people who are quietly, selflessly and lovingly going about their business, taking care of their loved ones, performing what we would think of as unsung work. But it's work that is of benefit to our families and our communities and means that we are better off as a state. I note the significant role that carers do play, and often it's such a dual role alongside all the other elements to their lives and to the contributions that they are making to the community. I think that this legislation is symbolic in a sense in nature, but symbols are important. Recognition, formal recognition is important, and it's from that other kinds of tangible support and action can flow and can be given a greater imperative, which I think is particularly important. While we, as others have mentioned, will be the last state to have a standalone piece of legislation recognising carers in this way, I would hope that this would be a pivot point for our state, and as has been mentioned and suggested by others, this would be a moment for us to take the opportunity to move into a leadership role nationally and look to some items where we can actually stride out and take leadership rather than be the one that lags behind. And I know some other members have made suggestions on what some of those priorities might be. Mr President, I believe that the charter that's formalised in this bill and developed in consultation with carers here in Tasmania is a really positive and vital step forward. I know too that there's a significance to the change that I believe has occurred where we had previously had a carers issues reference group in place that has helped inform and shape things like the action plan and things like this legislation. There's now been an elevation of that group, if you like, to now being the Minister's Carer Advisory Council. And I think that's really appropriate and pleasing to see. If you will, it's a name change, but it's an important name change. Again, symbols can be important. It recognises that being called the Minister's Carers Advisory Council elevates that group and the importance they hold as a voice for the community and carers in the community in particular to feed in directly to the Minister when it comes to policy development and tangible plans going forward. So that's a pleasing improvement and development to note. But to note that in the Act that we're looking at, there's a review period built in 5 years' time, and I think that that's really important. We know that these things need to be kept up to date. We know we need to check in and see whether something has functioned the way we hoped it would, and if there is indeed a requirement to provide some updating, or some adjustment, or some additional work. I do also note that there's a Federal Carer Recognition Act, and maybe that's also in need of review. I'm not sure what the if there is a built-in review to that. It is, I believe, more than a decade old. So perhaps there's some advocacy there if there isn't an automatic review period for a review to occur. Now that every other state and territory, Tasmania being the last, have introduced their own legislation, perhaps that could feed well through to a renewal or review of the Federal Carer Recognition Act. I do note that the Senate Select Committee on Work and Care has provided additional insights in terms of supporting carers, particularly those engaged in the workforce. Others have mentioned some of these figures here. I won't go in detail, noting they're already on the record, but the thing that did strike me was work from that committee which noted that on average Australian carers will lose close to $400,000, Mr President, in lifetime earnings at the age of 67, and that's also $175,000 in super by that age. That's a striking figure of the price that's paid in dollar terms. We know there are other prices paid or other costs to being a carer alongside the love and support that's being provided. And it's not insignificant, and it has tangible impacts to have those lifetime earnings and the superannuation available be so depleted. I think others have mentioned, and I will touch briefly on the fact that there's also a gender element to that, with figures coming out of that Senate committee showing that over 52% of superannuation gender gap in carers at retirement age, that a 52% superannuation gender gap exists in carers at retirement age, and male carers averaging approximately close to $300,000 in their super at retirement, whereas female caregivers averaging about $138,000. That's a significant difference. And we know that that's sort of reflective of other gendered impacts when it comes to earnings and to superannuation, but since carers do have that gender differential, it's important for us to understand the financial fallout of that as well. 3 in 4 primary carers being women. I'd be quite interested to hear from the government, noting that the Carer Action Plan is to be updated in 2024 or tips over into a new iteration in 2024, how the government's going to look to more specifically address issues relevant to female and gender diverse individuals who are carers, maybe even some details about how carers are currently supported in their employment within government agencies, and efforts being made by the government there. On government agencies, I note that the section in the bill, Section 7, outlines the obligations of state service agencies in relation to this legislation, and it requires each agency to take reasonable steps to implement the Carers Charter and Action Plan and to monitor and report to the Minister on steps taken by the agency to do that. I think that's an incredibly important accountability measure to put into this bill. It's really pleasing to see it there. Things need to be made visible and reported on in order then to be assessed in terms of their efficacy and whether they're driving the outcomes we're looking for. I would like to hear from the government if any state agencies had existing obligations under the Federal Carer Recognition Act, for example, on this sort of monitoring and reporting, and how that fits alongside these new obligations in our Act, if there's any correlations there between obligations under the Federal Act and this one. Mr President, I recognise too that the introduction of this legislation and the widening of its scope may also introduce additional responsibilities and requirements of Carers Tasmania as the peak body in the space. Others have noted this, and I'll just touch on it briefly. In previous budget submissions, the Minister, in relation to Carers Tasmania and previous budget submissions, I've quizzed the Minister in estimate sessions in past years, and there's been commitments expressed in that forum that they'll be looked at carefully, and there'll be an effort to be supportive. I hope that Carers Tas, given this bill, if it passes today, Carers Tas won't be backward in coming forward with their budget submissions to the Minister to really ensure that they've laid out clearly what they will need in terms of tangible funding support and other support to deliver on the requirements under the Act and the sorts of particularly changes in scope that it might hold for them. And I would hope that the Minister would welcome that and be very keen to deliver on providing that support.
Through you, Mr President, David and Julie might be able to add "and team" if that came forth, that funding.
Indeed, there might be at least a little bit of expansion amongst the staffing resources there, if that's what's required. And again, Carers Tas will know best, but having come from the community sector, Mr President, prior to being in this place, I know that it can be a difficult task sometimes to come forward with your hand out, but we all know that community organisations like Carers Tas are doing far more and achieving far more than they're funded for through the government, any government. That's not a comment on this government of the day, but generally funding is never enough to do the things that you are tasked to do, let alone need to do. So I hope that the passage of this bill provides some assistance, at least some really good spotlighting around better fulfilling needs in that space. Others here have mentioned the inclusion of kinship carers within this bill in terms of the definitions of carers and the importance of that. I think that there's various complexities there, but I think it's really pleasing to see that expansion of scope, and I'm sure that the practicalities of that going forward is something that will be worked out over time. Certainly, anyone who is a kinship carer, whether they be grandparents caring for grandchildren or any other family relationships that's a kinship relationship, support is needed, and often significant support, and recognition is needed of that role being undertaken. So as others have discussed in more detail, that'll be something I think for all of us to be closely monitoring as we go ahead. And again, particularly, there might be more in the next iteration of the Tasmanian Carer Action Plan, more of a focus into that space. I do note the discussion that's been had both in briefings that we had and in some contributions today that there's a real focus looking forward on the need to better identify and then support carers who are children and young people, and that's a particular cohort that can be difficult potentially to see in our community and to recognise and then to furnish with the support that they need. I strongly support this advocacy focus on the children and young people in our community who are carers, and I hope that quick progress is made to better find ways and put things in place to support children and young people who are carers. I know that one way of doing that may be through the school system, to be able to better in terms of children and young people's connection with school, that might be a good location in which to identify their needs as carers and better support them. It also might be that some of those children who are carers might be finding it difficult to stay engaged and be at school. So again, there might be some limitations around utilising the education system to connect through to them. And certainly I say that thinking back on my previous role when I worked at Anglicare in the Social Action and Research Centre. One of the key researchers in that team, Dr. Catherine Robinson, did a lot of work around highly vulnerable teens in Tasmania. And a really striking finding from the research work that she did was that many young children, really, and young people in that 10 to 17 age bracket who are highly vulnerable, and that's that they're having trouble in their family environment and potentially with issues of homelessness. They're having trouble with engagement with education. They might have youth justice connections. They might have issues around mental health and trauma, drug and alcohol use. All sorts of those categories all coming together in a mix. The research that she did showed that those teens, highly vulnerable teens, were also actually had a high likelihood of being carers during their childhood. And so one of the things that makes me think about is, would we also perhaps need to better understand where children and young people who are carers, where they sit in our community? Are they more likely to be in lower socioeconomic groups, for example? Are they more likely to be facing other forms of vulnerability? And how does that need to intersect with the way that we identify them and then support them in their carers role? Certainly, I think we would need to understand the shape of that cohort and its needs to really effectively support them. I do notice that when I look in the Tasmanian Carer Action Plan to see what is in there about children currently, you can't help but be a little bit concerned that it's lacking. There is recognition that there's a need to develop targeted information and referral resources for learners with caring responsibilities. So within the Department of Education, there's a commitment here in the action plan to update information and referral resources for learners with caring responsibilities. And then there's a second action there to promote those resources for young carers to Department of Education learners, schools and support staff. Now that's fantastic. Information is important, but it's also not tangible support.
Yes, so through you, Mr President, I'm informed that due to the passing of this bill, when it happens, that will be updated.
Excellent, and it will be wonderful to see elements of the action plan that are more actively focused towards providing support to young carers in particular, because the provision of information is one thing, but if young carers are even struggling to be at school where they might encounter those resources, it's really more tangible support that they're going to be requiring rather than a brochure. Mr President, the other thing I just would note, and again I think in a contextual sense for this bill, this recognition bill of carers, and that's that at times there's going to be circumstances in our community where carers are potentially affected more significantly. And of course the thing that would come to mind most readily is our experience over these past 3 years of COVID and our ongoing experience of COVID, as we are now still living with it in our community. And I can't help but note that we haven't really acknowledged that at any stage in our contributions thus far. And it's telling in a way. It's probably a little bit telling in regards to the real visibility about the lived reality day to day of carers in the community. One of the things that I imagine, but again, it hasn't been visible enough to me, Mr President, so I can't put data to it or an evidence base to it, but one of the things I imagine is that as we are all here now living with COVID in an ongoing way, I imagine that carers as a cohort are some within our community who are still feeling that most highly in terms of impact on daily life. And that while potentially you or I, Mr President, might not be doing much in our day-to-day life to have to accommodate COVID, there'd be significant numbers of carers in the community who probably are still having to take daily actions or daily measures to help manage vulnerability and matters to do with COVID. And so I think it's probably helpful for us to be aware of those sorts of situations as a community, we can all feel like we're moving on from something, but I would think that carers as a cohort at times are going to be one of those vulnerable groups. We need to be mindful about the fact that their experience may be different from the general community. And I think we probably could be more mindful of having a more active conversation about ongoing impacts of COVID for those sorts of cohorts who may be experiencing those vulnerabilities and having to manage it more actively on a day-to-day basis. So having said that, Mr President, in closing, I would just echo what others here have said, and that this is a recognition bill, and certainly it's very pleasing to be able to be in a position to support this bill, that it's finally come to us, and to take the chance to put on the record my sincere gratitude and recognition of each and every carer across our state. I appreciate, and we all appreciate, the contribution that you are making, not just to your personal family and close associates, but to our whole community in the work that you're doing and the care that you're providing. So, Mr President, I'm more than happy to say that I support this bill and congratulate all those involved in seeing it brought to us finally.